Hello there, and welcome to Magic by Design, the podcast where my brother and I attempt to review every Disney animated feature in a bid to discover the secrets behind the magic. My name is Ken, and I am joined by my co-host / brother, Garrett. Gar, how are you?
Which am I first? Am I your co-host or your brother? Which is your priority to you right now?
You're my brother in my heart.
Okay.
And my co-host in real life.
This is all I am to you, just a professional sit across a microphone from you and speak. We're like, there was I don't remember the name of the website, but they do like, it's The Onion, but for like pop culture. And it's like, you know, the people, the McElroy brothers who host My Brother and all that stuff, they're like, McElroy brothers have historic 15 minutes where they're not recording each other. That's basically your relationship with me, isn't it?
Yeah, I record our conversations at all times.
As far as you don't just start uploading me as a podcast, and then you can have me cancelled, obviously, as revenge for me cancelling you on last week's episode.
Yeah, Gar, if I could have one request for this week's episode, it's to please don't cancel me.
If you're not a sexist in this week's episode, I won't cancel you.
What's a sexist?
People who don't like sexting. It's a subgenre of sexism.
No comment.
Okay.
This week, we watched Disney's second animated feature offering, Pinocchio, but before we dive into the review of the film, Gar, what are your initial thoughts? Curious face.
Last week, after we finished the podcast, I was like, you know what I'm going to do to add value to this podcast, Ken? I'm going to start reading the source material.
I remember you saying that. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, did you do it? I don't think you did.
This is where, if this was a video podcast, a vodcast, if you will, I would insist that you say, of course I read it, Ken. I read the source material in its entirety. And then we do a whole bit where my nose grew, and that relates back to Pinocchio, and it's very funny. Just assume that's happening, because there's no proof of the contrary. I did read 27% of Pinocchio, which is probably like 35 pages. But then I got bored and stopped.
Is it really long?
It's 150 pages. It's longer than I thought it would be. That's the reason I was like, oh, it'll take me like an hour to bang through. It's a kid's book. It's a kid's story. It's like, no, it's 150 pages.
I hadn't read the source material because I trusted you to do it, Garrett. Mm-hmm. I'm the animation history guy. You were bringing the lore to the podcast as promised, but you have not delivered. Please apologise to our listeners.
I will bring 27% of the lore as illustrated by the Kindle. I was like, this morning, I got up a little early and everything and started reading it, and then got an hour in and it's like, ugh. It's boring. Reading is hard. But I will have some thoughts on the book, Ken, which is not very different. It's tonally different, but we'll get into that when we talk about it. My other deep relationship with Pinocchio is, of course, Kingdom Hearts, which is where 90% of my Disney knowledge comes from, other than watching the films.
You mentioned this last night, and you are a big fan of the Kingdom Hearts franchise.
Yes.
How far does it go into the story of Pinocchio? Does it like reveal new elements of the story, or is it just kind of like outside of the canon?
It's entirely outside of do you think that Disney are going to be like, yes, Kingdom Hearts, I'm going to trust you to tell new aspects of the Pinocchio story, and yes, all will be good. There's a level in Kingdom Hearts 1. Monstro is not a sea whale in Kingdom Hearts 1. He's a space whale. So you're flying around space, and you're like, woo, Chippendale in your gummy ship, and then you fly into the mouth of Monstro, who's for some reason flying through space. And then, yeah, there's a whole thing with Pinocchio, and eventually Pinocchio is reunited with Geppetto in Traverse Town, which has great music. So there's your Pinocchio and Kingdom Hearts update.
Listening to that, I can kind of understand why they didn't give Kingdom Hearts the keys to the Magic Castle.
Nobody in the history of the world should give Square Enix the keys to any castle, unless you want a needlessly convoluted story and characters with lots of zippers.
Gar, I thought we'd start off again this week with the background to the production of Pinocchio. Mm-hmm. You ready?
It's interesting because this, obviously, they slaved over Snow White. You know, they took their time. It took 4 years, whereas like this is 2 years later. We're making another one.
Yeah, production began in 1938, and the film was released in February. I find February hard to say.
You're not the only one. If you listen to the West Wing Weekly, they have a whole bit about how he hates saying February because that or is hard to pronounce.
I think, like, as a people, we've decided to drop the or.
Well, it's because we say February because it's harder to say February.
I'm going to go with February because it's easier to say. It was released in February 1940.
You mispronounced February there, Ken. This is why he hates me.
You literally took my breath away with your terrible timing.
Take my breath away.
In September 1937, during the production of Snow White, an animator called Norman Ferguson brought the book, which you tried to read.
I didn't try to. I read 27% of.
Yep.
I like the way Kindle gives you an exact percentage. It's not like, they don't even give you pages, because their pages don't obviously correlate to actual pages. It's like, yes, you have read 27% of this book.
Do you know the way Kindle and Audible give you badges for accomplishments in reading or listening?
Yes.
Did you get a quitter badge?
No, but I should. It's not a quitter. It's I've had enough of this story now.
Anyway, this fella called Norman Ferguson gave the book to Walt, and apparently he was busting his gut with enthusiasm.
Ooh. So Walt was like, oh, kids, I hate them.
I miss old-timey statements like that. We don't say
Busting
things like
your
that anymore.
gut with enthusiasm. That's me every Saturday morning when we start recording. Morning, it's 4:00 in the day. That's morning to me when we start recording this podcast.
Interestingly, we talked about this last week as well. There's a bit of a shuffle in terms of the order they intended to make these films, because Bambi was intended to be second.
Ooh, why'd they bump it?
Because they've had trouble with the story, because it's based on I think it's either an Austrian or a German book. We'll talk about that when we get to it.
Yes.
And
we'll research Bambi when we have to research Bambi. Actually, no. You will research Bambi when you have to research Bambi. I'll read 27% of the Bambi book and then show up.
Yeah, so with Bambi, they had troubles with the story and animating realistic animals, so they bumped it to third. Pinocchio cost $2.8 million to make. And having watched it, we'll get into it. I don't really see where that money went.
It's just like, I think that's just the base cost of animation in that day, wasn't it? Like, you see stuff, so there's some animated films, and they're like, it cost $200 million. And you're like, how the hell did this 90-minute film cost $200 million? It's because it's painstakingly expensive to do that, and and very time-consuming.
So in today's money, it would be around 51.5 million. But if you look at it, it's like double the budget of Snow White, even though, as you said, it took 2 years. And in some ways, it's not as sophisticated. But one of the interesting notes here is that following the success of Snow White, Walt wanted to use famous actors for the voices. So maybe that's where a lot of the cost went to.
But it is funny. Remember when we were talking about the Snow White, and I'm like, I'm impressed with how few corners they cut. They started cutting corners with Pinocchio.
Yeah, we'll get into that when we talk about the animation. But Pinocchio seems like a bit of a rush job. Overall, to me, like
I think it still looks very good. Don't get me wrong, but it's like there is the points in this where it's like, oh, we're gonna just keep a close shot here, so we don't have to animate too much in the background, or anything that's hard, we're just not going to do, or we're gonna just do sequences of animation that don't require much effort. Well, not much effort, but less effort. They all require a lot of effort.
Overall, to me, it seemed like kind of like Snow White, except a step backwards, where it was a series of sequences in which they put in a lot of effort and a lot of detail mixed with stuff that they kind of skated over just to piece together a story.
Just to get to 88 minutes.
Yeah. So just to give you a context there, it was supposed to cost 500,000, which is about 9.2 million in 2020 bucks.
They have a big habit of completely missing their budget estimates.
Yeah.
By usually factors of 4 or 5.
Yeah, so
they made tons of money from Snow White, so they could afford to pile some money. I assume, like, when they budgeted $500,000 for Pinocchio, it was probably before Snow White came out, and then Snow White made, like, whatever it was, $200 million, and they were like, all right, we can maybe spend a little more money on Pinocchio now.
It's interesting because the budget for Snow White was 250 million, and they went like...
1,000.
What?
250,000, I'd imagine, not 250 million all the way back. 250 million in the year 1938 would be like the entire GDP of most countries.
Gar, I was talking about inflation in 2050.
Oh, right. Well done.
I was about to mention that if you didn't interrupt me.
Sure.
Anyway.
Ken's nose just grew.
2 sizes. So if you look at it, they basically doubled the budget of Snow White and produce something that's possibly on par. Like, in most people's minds, it's as good, but I don't know.
I think it's just clear they had less time. It's not a money problem. It's they had less time. Because while this film was conceptualized in 1938, I imagine it wasn't put into production until after Snow White was made. At least not in a major way. And then they had 2 years to churn this bad boy out instead of 4. And at that stage, that's more effort. It takes more time. Well, it's not more. You have to put more time and more effort into less time. And that's where corners come from. Deadlines is where cutting corners comes from.
It felt like to me that they were in a rush to capitalize on the success of Snow White, so they wanted to put something out there.
Oh, they couldn't go longer than 2 years.
Exactly. This is a new process. 2 years was too little time. 4 years was pushing it even for Snow White, And
of course, we get them yearly, sometimes twice yearly these days.
It's funny you mentioned that Snow White made a lot of money as well, Garvik, because this film made much less than expected.
It still made a ton of money, though, didn't it?
Actually, it didn't, because the release of the film coincided with the out of World War II in Asia and Europe, so that was 2 major markets cut off.
Oh no. Well, didn't it make like $100 million?
No.
Sure, I'm checking this. This feels like a Ken fact. I'm double checking the Ken facts.
Gar, I have a point now that elaborates on that point, if you would listen to me, please.
Sure.
It took over 5 years to make a profit and only reached profit on the 1945 reissue.
So the box office number on Wikipedia, it says 164 million.
Eventually.
All right. You always have to double check Ken facts.
At the time, it didn't make much money.
Like, there was a Ken fact in the first episode where you said, there was 70 songs, and then Nicole contradicted you in the back. It's like, edit. I'm now exposing Ken's edits.
There's a lot of figures that go with Snow White, Gar, and I mixed up my figures, and I rectified it.
There you go, but I still exposed you, because I'm an asshole.
I could edit this out.
You could just, this could just be a monologue by the end of it. It's like, and joining me is my brother and co-host, and you just continue on.
Yeah, and as we said last week, I'll just put in your bits through the other podcasts that you've done.
Yes, you could.
Mostly your responses would be, good point, Ken.
I've never said those words in my life.
Yes, you have. In my mind. So, talking about the animation, Gar, as we said, it feels like they put less of a focus on human characters, and the human characters they did do, they took a few shortcuts, like, a lot of close-ups of feet or close-ups of midsections, or
maybe that's just a fetish, Ken, not a shortcut.
Perhaps.
We gotta have a close-up of the feet.
But they did seem to pull themselves back from trying to create realistic humans in this film.
There is only one realistic human, really, and that's the fairy. And she stands out like a sore thumb throughout the entire film. She looks completely different from the rest of the film, which is very strange. She looks like a relic from Snow White, lifted into this film, which it looks more like a fairy tale and whimsical, the animation style is different than Snow White. It's not as going for as realistic. It's not even as painterly. It's as more like polished animation as you'd expect, isn't it?
Yeah, it's more graphic to me, with like solid lines and kind of like solid colours. And I agree with you. I think the fairy stuck out too much, and I think they did it like that on purpose to kind of have her kind of be a kind of a
mystical figure that is completely different than everything in the world around her, which does work. That works on a thematic level. But
if you look at it, they only animate her in like mid and wide shots, and when she moves, she floats. So they really kind of...
We don't want her walking. It's too hard.
She seems to appear at really random times throughout the film just to move the plot along.
I'll only help you one more time, Pinocchio. Except the other times I will also help you.
Like with Snow White, they used live-action reference footage, but you could see a difference in the fact that if you look at the movement of the characters, it was a bit more cartoonish.
I was going to say something very mean, but I won't.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, did they use you for reference as Pinocchio because of how wooden you are? I've broken Ken's non-existent wooden heart.
The podcast is cancelled after 2 episodes. They used the reference footage like Snow White, Gar, as I was saying before you rudely interrupted me.
I'm very rude.
Remember we talked about last week where it's a kind of a bit of some of the motions were kind of jerky and unrealistic. They filled those in between poses with more cartoonish movements, which is why they're quite bouncy.
Like floating, as you mentioned in the case of the fairy.
So it's interesting because it develops further the Disney style, and even the character animation is very reminiscent of even the current Disney style. But it also shows that they weren't ready to animate humans.
See, it's interesting. Like, if you were asking me, it's different. Would you ask, what do I call it, worse? No. As you said, I think it looks more like the Disney films that I know than Snow White does. Even though, as you can, it's probably not as elaborately animated, which is an interesting comparison. It feels more timelessly Disney than Snow White does.
It does. It feels more relatable in the sense of what I know as Disney.
And it feels like looking at Disney or Snow White, the animation is actually it's very impressive. But, it looks like 1938 animation. Whereas this looks more modern. It feels more modern. And maybe that's because Disney, standardized the processes after this. So that, again, in our minds, who have seen all the future Disney films, we're like, oh yeah, that's Disney, So that's maybe what's going on in my brain. But who knows?
I did feel myself watching it, wondering if it was the original version. Because, as you said, it did look quite good for modern standards. And I was thinking to myself, is this like a reissue or a different version? Because
or have they just touched it up?
Yeah, it is very modern looking compared to Snow White. Snow White has a more handmade painterly effect, as you said. And this has a more kind of solid looking kind of look. It looks more together.
Looks like a cartoon.
But saying that, some of the in-between shots, not even wide shots, like wide shots you can get away with not fully animating something. Mid shots of like crowds and characters were like completely unfinished, as in like almost look like sketches.
And there's the weird black things at the end of the film that I think are meant to be monkeys or weird ghouls or I don't know. It's just like, it'll take too much effort to make this into an actual thing. So it's just going to be a weird gorilla-shaped mass of black.
Yeah, shadow monsters, I call them.
Yeah, they look. It's a very. This film is kind of strange from it weirdly like walks that realistic versus fairy tale line, where it's like Geppetto's just a normal character who lives in a house, but then you have these weird shadow monsters and children turning into donkeys and things coming to life and fairies. So it's like it is a magical world, but on the surface it doesn't feel like one. So even that feels slightly jarring.
Before we move on to the story, because I think we're touching on elements of the story there, I think there's some interesting stuff to dive into. Pinocchio was a landmark film in terms of visual effects. So things like water, vehicles, fairy dust, all those kind of otherworldly things that are not, rain appears in the film as well. Things that you can't really do with traditional hand-drawn animation. So we're seeing for the first time as well the emergence of distinct departments within Disney. So there's actually an effects animation department who deals solely with the effects and
with the magic sparkling effect whenever the fairy does anything,
and then the character animation,
which is funny because the character animation one went away and the effects one is basically all it is now. It's all computer effects now. Who won that war in the end? Disney.
Well, I think there is still something to be said, like for the characters. I know they're easier to design because you can create things in a computer much easier than you do
to draw it and animate it by hand. Yes,
but the characters still drive the film. So while maybe some of the charm is lost in effects these days, I think the character animation in Disney is still quite strong. But we'll get there, Gar. We're on a journey.
Yes, we're only on number 2 of 58. It'll probably be more than 58 by the time we finish. I assume there's something coming out. Though these days, who knows? Nothing. There might never be a Disney film again.
Gar, don't say that.
It's a bleak world we live in at the moment, Ken.
Don't you say that. Let's give me a moment. The podcast will die at 58 episodes and everyone will miss us.
Yes. Then we'll start making Disney films. And then start reviewing our own work.
I think we're as important to the Disney canon as Disney films at this point.
I'd like to think so. Again, that's where stuff like Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, like Mirror, Mirror on the Wall is basically the original Ken fact, if you think about it.
You're the original Ken fact.
So's your face. You hated me as a child. As a
Are we going to unpack
baby.
This now?
Yes, there's
mid-podcast.
You brought this up, but there's a photo of us as children where like we're both in the bath and I'm there splashing water, having a good time as a 1-year-old or whatever, and you're behind me there staring daggers into the back of my head as if I'm the worst thing that has ever happened to you. So I'm sorry, Ken. I'm sorry that I exist. Like Pinocchio, I became a real boy, and you envied it. If this is a thematic relation to Pinocchio, you are Figaro, and I am Pinocchio.
Silence.
Ken's got nothing. I have unpacked Pinocchio in our life, and Ken's got nothing.
Well, at least I got a podcast co-host out of it.
Well, hey, so I'm definitely co-host first, brother second.
One of the things that impressed me was the treatment of water in this film. Now, obviously there's been major developments since, and as you said, computers can do it with a click of a button these days, but they straddle a good line between like a realistic depiction of water, as realistic it could be in animation at the time, and like an impressionistic kind of painterly effect. I thought it was really one of the more striking parts of the film.
Actually, it's where the animation feels most stretched, particularly at the very end when Monstro's like splashing about and creating tidal waves. And I think that's where the animation's like, oh, we're really struggling with this.
I would agree with you to an extent, but I do appreciate the effort that went into it, and I appreciate that it was kind of a move forward in the medium of animating water.
Yeah, but it looked bad. They tried. Bless them. It's very hard. We all, well, I don't know. I've never animated a thing in my life. But by all accounts, water, very hard. So when you have a giant whale splashing about creating tidal waves and the frame rate drops and it's suddenly like a little less easy to distinguish what the hell is happening, you understand why that happens because they're doing their best in 1940, goddammit.
Waves are a little bit weird, but what I was referring to more is the still water and like the shine on the water and things like bubbles and the underwater scene where Pinocchio goes looking for Geppetto.
Yeah. But then they actually had to animate the water moving, and they're like, oh dear God, what have we done?
There's a scene towards the end where they all wash up on the beach after fighting Monstro. I'll get on to Monstro in a second there. I have some thoughts on Monstro. Mm-hmm. And Pinocchio's lying face down in water, and I thought that looked like obviously very graphic and very upsetting, but it looks very cool.
It's very funny. This is just like he's face down dead in the water on the beach, and Jiminy Cricket's like, oh Pinocchio, oh no!
Going back to Monstro, Gar, I thought he stood out in a bad way.
Animation-wise or story-wise?
Animation-wise.
Yeah, he looks again, similar to the fairy. He looks like he's out of a completely different film.
As we talked about earlier, a lot of the characters are quite solid in terms of their colour and their lines, and he was quite almost like a charcoal sketch or something like that.
Maybe because he's so big and they want it to be like, he's a whale, so he has to be big. It's not like they can be like, oh, look at this whale who's the size of Pinocchio. It's like, no, he has to eat a giant fish or a ship. He has to be at least big enough to fit a ship in his stomach. So maybe that's what they struggled with, to create the scale of that relative to everything else.
Yeah, something that's hand painted, but using that much mass and colour, it can't be solid.
And usually he has to appear on the screen with something else, so you can't just, have it be Monstro. Though I think a lot of the time they do try and avoid having Monstro appear on the screen with other things to get rid of that very problem of creating scale issues where Monstro is meant to be gigantic. And like relative to Pinocchio, who would be a speck, and Jiminy Cricket even more so compared to Monstro, they'd be completely invisible if you were to like render Monstro to scale.
Yeah, so again, we have to look at it in the context of the time, the limitations they had. I think
they bottled it, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Just like Jiminy Cricket was bottled in the fight against Monstro. They bottled it.
I don't think they...
No, it looks fine.
That's a really harsh way of putting it, Garrett.
I'm just putting words in your mouth. Don't worry about it.
Monstro, I think, is an iconic character. A lot of people were afraid of Monstro as a kid. And we're going to get on to the story in a second. Actually, that's a good segue into the story, Gar.
Yes.
Were you afraid of Monstro as a kid, or do you find him scary now?
I don't think I've seen this. I might have. I've seen some of it. I think I saw like the first 30 minutes, and then the rest of Pinocchio is just like cultural references that I understand, like the growing nose, which, as you mentioned last night while we were watching it, only happens once in the film.
Yeah, it's one of the most iconic things about Pinocchio. People go, oh, what's Pinocchio about? It's like, his nose grows when he lies. Only once does that happen in the film.
Yeah, so it's not they mention it in the book. Maybe it happens further past 27. It was 27%, but they do mention boys who lie, their nose grow. It's like that's where it comes from. It is in the book, or at least in the first 27%. But yeah, it's interesting again that like it's somewhat similar to Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. It's at least factually accurate to something that's in the film. But it's like, as you said, it's a 2-minute segment of an 88-minute film that became a defining feature of the film, which is very interesting.
I think people leaned into it more in subsequent adaptations, so maybe that's why people associate it more with Pinocchio.
And maybe it does play a more prominent role in the other 73% of the book. Who could possibly know? Going
back to your point, Gar, I saw it as a child, and it did have a fond place in my heart, and I watched it more recently. Well, recently I say in the last 5 or 6 years. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it I still didn't remember, even on rewatching last night. Monstro I never really found kind of scary. But Gar, you read 27% of the book.
Yes.
As we dive into the story here, do you want to tell us what you've learned?
Okay, it's very important. I took notes on the book as well. So Pinocchio does not actually, he's not originally a puppet that comes to life. He starts where a carpenter finds a piece of wood that can talk, and the wood is being mean to him, and he's very upset because he's like, who's been mean to me? I'm a carpenter. And he doesn't realize the wood is talking. So then Geppetto goes into the workshop and also hears the wood talking. So Geppetto's like, oh, I would like Geppetto is actually not a manufacturer of Pinocchio. He gets the carpenter to make Pinocchio in the book, and there is a fun fact. But Geppetto would like a puppet so that he can travel the world with a puppet and make money. He wants a puppet that has acrobatic skills and can move. But then when they accidentally carve, not accidentally, I think it's deliberately carve the puppet out of the magic piece of wood that's alive, Pinocchio obviously comes to life because that's how that works. And Pinocchio is an asshole. Pinocchio in the book is the absolute worst. And it's actually a big deviation in the film, where in the film Pinocchio is like naive and kind of just completely aloof to everything in the world. He does not understand a single thing. Whereas in the book, he's just a jerk. He's just like, I run away. He runs away from Geppetto immediately. Geppetto then gets arrested and thrown in jail for, I think it's child abuse for a night, because people are like, you look at you abusing this child, go to jail, Geppetto. Then Jiminy Cricket shows up, not named Jiminy Cricket, just named a Cricket. And the Cricket's like, Pinocchio, children, they never get anywhere in life. So Pinocchio kills Jiminy Cricket with a hammer.
I actually had this in my notes as well. In the original story, he's called the Talking Cricket.
Yes, and Pinocchio kills him with a hammer. And later in the film, and then Pinocchio was like...
It's not a film, Gar, it's a book.
Yes, same thing. It's like...
a millennial.
It's a film with words. Then Pinocchio goes on to discover that Jiminy was right. Like, multiple times he's like, oh, the talking cricket was right. Children who misbehave never go anywhere. And then the ghost of the ghost of the cricket shows
also
up.
in my notes.
The ghost of the cricket is like, then he shows up later to give him sage wisdom again. And Pinocchio ignores him again. Pinocchio, real asshole. Like, Jiminy... Or Geppetto eventually comes to love Pinocchio. Pinocchio's feet burn off. Then Geppetto makes him new feet and then sells his own coat to get the money to buy the book so he can go to school. Then he sends him off to school, and on the way to school, he sells that book for a ticket to a puppet show. Pinocchio, asshole. So yeah, a lot of the characters show up. By the time I got to 27%, the fox and the cat showed up and tried to rob him of the money.
I thought initially when I was watching this film, it's like, going back to our point earlier, it's like, hey there, I'm pretty sure those are supposed to be human characters, but you find them too hard, so you just made them cartoonish animals for the sake of ease. But yes, they appear in the original book.
Yeah, and the Puppet Master story is a little different in the book, as opposed to him exploiting Pinocchio for profit. He wants to burn Pinocchio so he can cook his mutton, and then he spares Pinocchio's life, and instead tries to burn another one of his puppets to cook his mutton before Pinocchio pleads for the life of the other puppet. And the circus master or whatever, the puppet master, is eventually he's called the fire master or something in the actual book, is eventually like, all right, I will eat my mutton half raw. This is the sacrifice I'm making so all of you can stay alive. Before he eventually gives Pinocchio 5 gold shillings to go back to Geppetto with. Guess what? Pinocchio doesn't go back to Geppetto with the shillings because Pinocchio is an asshole. The fox and the cat show up and they're like, hey, if you plant them in this field, they'll grow into a money tree. And Pinocchio's like, gee whiz, I'd love a money tree. And that's where I stopped reading. Actually, no, then he goes to try and find the money tree and he gets robbed by assassins. And they're actually called assassins. And that's where I finished reading. So that is my review of the first 27% of Pinocchio.
First question out of that, how did you get bored?
I know, well, Pinocchio's too much of an asshole for me. That's like, he's a jerk. He's like, it's not like, I assume they redeem him in the back half where he realizes the error of his ways and he should be nice to people. But it's like, he's just an unrelenting jerk. He's so mean and self-centered and selfish and he's just, no, I don't want to see this character redeemed. I wish he burned in the fire in the first place, not just his feet.
For me,
Ken is like...
yeah, I was like, that's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot of Pinocchio there.
A criticism of Pinocchio in the Disney animation is that he's too naive, or like people think that, like, how can he keep getting duped by all these characters? But actually, if we think about it, we talked about this last night, it's actually quite realistic for Pinocchio to be so naive because he literally just came to life yesterday.
He's a baby.
He knows nothing.
Literally, I just got so enamored with Pinocchio the book that I accidentally deleted my notes, but I have thankfully recovered them. But yes, he's a baby who knows nothing of the world. He's literally just born. Like, literally, everything is like, and what's that? And what's that? So, like,
and why? And why? And why?
Yeah, and that's the reason I'm much more fine with the Disney depiction of Pinocchio, in which he's just a child. You know, he's easily led astray, and Honest John will sing a song, and he'll be like, yeah, everything set to music has to be true. So Honest John will be like, and you will make so much money as an actor, yay! And then Pinocchio's like, yay! And then Honest John is like, and you will go to the island and be a happy child. And he's like, oh, happy child, cigars.
The story team found that Pinocchio was being led astray too often by deceiving characters, and there was no real logical way to get him back on track. So while it's a more appealing portrayal of Pinocchio, it led to story problems. So that's why Jiminy Cricket was created. So Jiminy Cricket actually is a Disney creation in the way he appears in the film. So yes, he attempts to be Pinocchio's conscience in the book before he murders him. Mm-hmm. In this, he was specifically used to, obviously to drive the story because he partly narrates it as well. Yes. But he was used to bring Pinocchio back on track because otherwise, how do you, as you said, he's a naive child with no context for the world. So how do you bring him back on track? So that's why Jiminy was expanded to be his conscience.
And he wasn't killed and he didn't come back as a ghost. Though I would have liked Jiminy coming back as a ghost. That would have been quite funny.
It would. Fun fact, Gar, in the original book, Monstro is not called Monstro, obviously, and he's described as a terrible dogfish-like sea creature.
What's a dogfish? Is it a fish that looks like a dog?
It actually looks nothing like a dog. I looked this up yesterday. So I can understand why Disney maybe changed that as well, because nobody knows what a dogfish is, or like nobody can conceptualize a giant dogfish, where a giant whale is much more easy to grasp.
Can you catch a dogfish in Animal Crossing?
I think so.
I want to catch a dogfish in Animal Crossing, and then I'm going to name him Monstro, and I'm going to display him in my house. Now I'm going to I assume there's a puppet there somewhere, so with strings. I'm going to recreate Pinocchio in my Animal Crossing village, is what I'm saying. I'm actually not. That would take a lot of effort, but people can probably do that.
Plus, Animal Crossing is a bit random in the items you receive, so you'll have to wait to get those items by chance, and that might never happen. And
if there is dogfish in the game, they might not be summer fish, because fishes are seasonal and monthly. So it might be like, might have to wait till like December to get a dogfish.
This podcast is now the Animal Crossing's New Horizon podcast.
I'm very upset when people make like really elaborate things in their Animal Crossing village, and I'm like, how do you make this? It's like, how did you put the time in to make the entire of Pokemon Johto inside of Animal Crossing? You crazy people.
Or some of the terraforming people are doing with the cliffs, and you showed me that really elaborate video during the week where someone made like a really long bridge to their museum flanked by waterfalls.
Yeah, waterfalls and tiki torches, creating a dramatic waterfall entrance to their museum that actually I think lagged the game. It was so elaborate. But alas, this isn't an Animal Crossing podcast, even though it could be.
Gary, you mentioned there that Disney made fundamental changes to the character Pinocchio in order to kind of impart themes and, you know, make him more appealing. One of the things that struck me about Pinocchio was that we're starting to see themes emerge for the first time.
Yeah, this film's about something as opposed to Snow White.
Where, like, if you look at Snow White, it's like, yeah, it's a fairy tale. It's following mostly the story that we know. But what do we learn from it? Not a whole lot.
Yeah, the themes of Pinocchio are very simple. They're like simple morals. They're like, go to school, don't drink and smoke cigars or you'll turn into a donkey, and don't lie or your nose will grow.
Speaking of donkeys, Gar.
All right.
Forget about Monstro. That's the bit I found terrifying.
Why? Do you hate donkeys?
I don't hate donkeys. They're adorable, first of all.
Okay.
The fact that you get transformed into something and then you're not human anymore, and then you get sold off into slavery and never see your parents again, that's terrifying.
That scared the heck out of you as a child.
Because there is an analogy for that in real life.
Kidnapping.
Kidnapping. Yes. So, like, that feels much more dangerous and real to me.
As opposed to a giant whale. What if you went on a boat? Giant whales are real.
Yeah, so...
I don't think they eat people that often, but they might.
The guy who is the child catcher who brings them to... was it Paradise Island?
Paradise Island.
Or Pleasure Island?
Pleasure? I thought of Paradise, but it could be either. Pleasure Island sounds more sexual.
He couldn't be more of a stereotypical English person. Now, obviously, I'm there for that because it's funny.
800 years of pain!
Yeah. We'll get into that in a future podcast, maybe. A bonus episode about the 800 years of oppression.
How does that tie into Disney?
On Ireland.
Is there a Disney film about the 800 years of oppression?
Okay, I think there's another reading of Pinocchio. No, never mind.
Pinocchio is the Irish guerrilla warfare, and the guy in the island is, I don't know.
Pinocchio, if you break it down to its bare bones, does follow the hero's journey. He has to prove his worth, and there's kind of a 3-act... Like, again, not so much a 3-act structure here. Kind of. You're starting to see more of a 3-act structure, but not... It kind of rushes through the phases, so, like, there's a big middle part.
I think there's a decent beginning, middle, end. There's like the construction of Pinocchio. Then there's the middle, which is like the whole puppet sequence. And then there's the end, which is Monstro. And there's, I think, the Pleasure Island bit, or Paradise Island, whichever one it was. I think that's the bit that feels most like out of place. Because like Monstro's the final act. A puppet thing is the middle act. Creation of Pinocchio is the start. And then there's like a 2.5 act in there in the middle with the whole turning into donkeys. It's like, all right.
Now,
like, if you took the entire turning into donkeys bit out of the film, I don't think anything about the film is really different, other than there's no weird children that smoke cigars and drink beer and play pool.
So
and are jerks.
What they're saying in this film is that bad kids at the time, they want to smoke cigars, drink beer, and wreck it.
Yeah, not go to school.
Not go to school.
Lie. And all the good kids shouldn't do that, and then you'll turn into a real boy.
They want to beat each other up as well.
And trash things.
I want to get punched in the face.
As you mentioned, every time he brings a bunch of kids to that island, does he have to like rebuild the buildings that they trashed? It's just like, all right, guys, my evil shadow men get to rebuilding.
I was actually going to get onto the Shadow Man. What are they?
No, I don't know. I don't know. As I said, this film weirdly walks a line of realism and mysticism that kind of jars at times. And then it's just like, there's just Shadow Men, and he has his own Shadow Men, and he's just turning people into donkeys. How is he turning people into donkeys? Not entirely sure.
It seems to be the beer, but we don't know what's in the beer. Is he a wizard? Or is he like...
How has he done this? How is he turning these children into donkeys? How come some of the donkeys can still talk? How come they established that some of the donkeys can still talk, and then that never goes anywhere? Or maybe that's just established why Pinocchio doesn't turn fully into a donkey? Yeah. I don't know. But Pinocchio doesn't turn fully into a donkey because Jiminy helps him escape the island.
And he doesn't drink all the beer.
Yeah. So how come some of the donkeys still have the power of speech as opposed to others? How come there's talking animals in this world? How come there's talking foxes and talking things? But the fish can't talk. So, like, what's going on here?
I think there was...
Why do fish eat cake? That's another important question.
Because they can?
Why can't Figaro... No, there's a talking cat in this film and a non-talking cat in this film. How does that make sense?
For me, Figaro is the standout.
Figaro is the standout. Figaro is actually briefly not mentioned by name. They mention Geppetto as a cat in the book. But yeah, they clearly expand Figaro into like one of the most classic Disney tropes, which is like cute animal sidekick. Which is like...
Disgruntled cute animal sidekick.
Yeah, it's Disney 101 when you go all the way up to like Moana. Like the cute animal sidekicks are a Disney specialty. And Figaro's the first one.
He's adorable. And he has his own little bed.
Yes, Figaro's the best. Figaro is actually my favourite thing in this film for a number of reasons. He's very charming. He's really well animated. Like, he's very expressive and he's very funny and he doesn't say a word, which always helps. And yeah, Figaro. Figaro should have gotten his own like spin-off. If this was made in 1995, Figaro would have gotten a Disney Channel spin-off cartoon.
He sure would have, and I would have been there for it.
Yeah.
I don't like cat scare, but if I ever get a cat, he will be called Figaro.
Yes, Figaro's a good cat name as well. Figaro, Figaro.
I want to go back to Pleasure Island. I think it's called Pleasure Island.
I'm going to look this up while you check.
Yeah, I'm going to fill time just for a moment there, because I think you mentioned it's the bit that sticks out the most. It's kind of like a sub-act, as it were. Mm-hmm. I would have felt better as a child, but also I would have felt better in terms of the story if they had resolved that somewhat. And it would have led into Pinocchio's journey if he obviously tried to escape, but then he realized all those boys were trapped, and then he went back to freedom, and then maybe somehow figured out how to turn them back into real boys.
It is Pleasure Island.
Nailed it.
Very sexual.
But I think that if you're going to do that, I think that act felt kind of weird because it's not even an act, but that storyline or that section felt weird because it was left unresolved. How do you feel about that, Gar?
First of all, I must read from the Wikipedia, which states... Once the boys have spent enough time being bad, they begin to succumb to a deadly curse that exists over the island, presumably planted via dark magic by Coachman himself, which turns them into donkeys, due to making complete jackasses of themselves, which is good natural justice, but I want to know why.
Do you think that's actual lore or someone's filled that in?
I think that's people filling in the gaps that just aren't told in the film. But yeah, donkeys. They could you could take that whole section out of the film, realistically. I like Geppetto was like, oh, Pinocchio, you're back. Oh. You're a donkey. All right.
Never mind.
Yes.
It's okay. Essentially, at its core as well, it's a morality tale, so let your conscience be your guide. It's something that kind of permeates to this day, doesn't it? Like, the notion of conscience that we would have grown up with is inextricably linked to this story.
Or maybe this story is inextricably linked to our notion of conscience.
Whoa.
What's the cause and effect there, Ken? Did conscience exist before Jiminy Cricket? Do we all have a Jiminy Cricket in our head that we throw hammers at and murder? And is that how bad people do bad things? They have to kill in their head the Jiminy Cricket.
I think there was the sense of morality and right and wrong, but I think
we had right and wrong in the 40s, right? I don't think Pinocchio invented right and wrong.
But I do think there's something to the fact that they invented a notion of conscience.
Nah.
As a kind of a physical thing. You think so?
No, there's like philosophical writings about conscience going back hundreds of years.
I know, but like what I'm saying is they brought it to the public consciousness.
And ideas of morality. Like Thomas Aquinas brought the conscience, issues of morality to public. Plato probably talked about morality.
This film is a. I'm moving on now because you buried my point.
Yeah, because it's wrong. Like Plato talked about his allegory of the cave and stuff like that. It's all about morality, all of that. Plato and Aristotle, and you did Leaving Cert Religion. You should know this.
You should.
You've forgotten all of your Leaving Cert Religion. It's only been 15 years.
It's not been 15 years, thank you very much.
13. Oh, sorry. No, 12.
12 years, thank you. So...
You got so offended at me suggesting you're old.
I'm only 31. Not even 31, Gareth.
There you go.
This film is a favourite of parents because it's basically a cautionary tale. It's like a schematic basically for...
Don't you act up, kids.
This is what you should be doing. This is what you should not be doing. Lying will only kind of get you so far and you'll always get caught out in the end. Another point is like overindulging in life's pleasures and only being concerned with oneself ultimately leads to unhappiness or suffering of others.
Yes.
So it's very much like an allegory for raising kids. Well, now, but especially at the time, the kind of philosophy for kids should be good and not hurt, basically.
Released right in the middle of World War II, a message we needed to hear at that time.
Yeah, so it's like, be good kids, say nothing, and sign up and get killed.
And also, it's particularly say nothing when the planes fly overhead.
It's I find that interesting. Also, Gar, where do we think this film is set? Do we think World War II broke out after Pinocchio became a real boy?
Yes. Well, it's set in Italy, isn't it?
I think
it feels like they didn't whitewash the Italian. Well, either way, whatever. The Italian washed the Italians out of this film. It's very Italian. They keep all the Italian names. Even the villages feel Italian. It's not like they overly Americanized it.
They did the dodgy Italian accents as well.
Well, yes, but there's that comes with the territory of 1940s Disney.
Actually, funnily enough, when Pinocchio becomes a real boy, he kind of looks like Snow White's baby.
Ah. That makes sense. It's actually weird. Pinocchio has mentions of a skin of pure white as well. That was a phrase. That was probably a dog whistling phrase in the 1940s and because it wasn't Walt Disney a Nazi.
Yeah, we're not going there. I'm going to bleep that.
All right. As we talk about a film released during World War II, it's just like, all right.
We'll get deeper into World War II as we talk through the next films, which were released in the context of the war.
Bambi is actually about losing your mother in the war.
Really?
I have no idea. Probably not.
Don't play with my emotions like that.
Oh, the film has a deep meaning. Who knows? That's really all of film criticism, though, isn't it? It's like, I find this deep meaning in the film. Or it's like, do you, though? Was that intended to be there? Though there's always the thing that when art is put out into the world, it is taken out of the hands of the creator. And messages that were not intended to be there can be found there, and they are valid.
Yeah, Gar.
You say that as if you contradicted me. It's like, yeah, Gar, thank you for correcting yourself.
No, actually, I was going to say something very similar, and you summed it up very beautifully. I'll give you credit for that.
I'm very smart.
The music of this film, I would say a marked improvement from Snow White.
Yeah, much better. You can hear it, which is a plus.
You can understand what they're saying. And it was the origins of the song When You Wish Upon a Star.
Which is basically the central thesis of Disney. You know, When You Wish Upon a Star, Dreams Come True, is like fundamental to the core of what Disney is.
Yep. It won the Academy Award for Best Original Song, the first Disney animated film to win a competitive Oscar.
Ooh.
As we know, Snow White won an honorary Oscar for its achievement in artistic endeavours.
There you go.
I was trying to think of the word. And then I was like, endeavours? Is that right?
It'll do.
It'll do. The American Film Institute. We praised them last week as well.
Did we?
Yes, we talked about their lists. They make lists of film.
Are they better than our lists? We're going to have to rank the songs afterward as well, aren't we?
We could rank the songs, but we'd have to do that in like a bonus episode. Just, that bonus content that people love.
Yeah, people do love bonus content.
They rank When You Wish Upon a Star as 7th in their 100 Greatest Songs in Film category.
Oh, all film. That's interesting. Because, if you were to say, is When You Wish Upon a Star the 7th best song in a Disney film? I'd be like, nah.
The film also won Best Original Score.
There you go. It has a very good score. Actually, no, the score is a step up from Snow White as well. It's very engaging. It's very relevant.
Actually, this is nothing to do with the music, but it just popped into my head because I meant to mention it earlier. This is the first time Disney probably had to pay for the rights to make a film.
Oh, yes, because Pinocchio was released in the late 1880s, I believe. I think it was like 1889 or 1887 or something like that.
1883. I have it in my notes.
There you go. Which means it would not have been out of copyright by the 1938 when they decided to make it. So they would have to pay for it. So they do, in fact, give credit at the start of the film.
Yeah.
Which, in fairness, if you base the thing off any source material, you should regardless. Which, I think they did in the first, didn't they? In Snow White, they say it's based off a Brothers Grimm fairy tale?
They probably say it, but they don't have to say it because it was in public domain.
Even if it's in public domain, you still have to attribute, the source material. Or at least, even if you don't, you should.
What about the other songs in this film, Gar?
No Strings on Me is a good song.
Solid. Hi Diddly Dee, An Actor's Life for Me, where he gets led astray to become an actor.
And there's a reprise of that when he's being led astray to become a
miscreant.
A Pleasure Island miscreant, yes. No Strings on Me, of course, appears in Avengers Age of Ultron. So if you're talking about the legacy of this film, there you go. It carries all the way, again, ties between early Disney and the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
peak slowed down sad version of happy songs.
Yes, it's actually the best thing about that film is the trailer with No Strings on Me being performed by Ultron, because Ultron is a suit of armor come to life. He's basically Pinocchio. Oh God, is Age of Ultron a Pinocchio remake? Except Pinocchio is evil? Whoa.
Anything else to say about the music?
I think the music is broadly, as I said, I think it's more catchy, it's more memorable, it's more clear, which again, always does help to be able to make out the lyrics. Yeah, I think it's a marked step up from Snow White, which has Hi-Ho, and that's about it.
Pretty much.
And Hi-Ho, as I said, is a 4-sentence long song.
Well, speaking of last week, did you enjoy Nicole's rendition of Someday My Prince Will Come?
I did, and that must be a tricky song to sing, because it's very operatic, isn't it? And there's that big high note at the end that's like, I don't have the range for anything, never mind something that's more operatic.
Yeah, so I think overall you can see an improvement in the sound quality, but as you said, once Snow White was in the can, I think they looked at the process and they standardized a lot of it and improved upon it. And of course, with the success of Snow White, they had the money to create better equipment or better processes or invest in like research and development, and that's something that Disney has always done. If you look back to Snow White, you look at Pinocchio, they had the live reference footage, they created models of the entire sets, and like when they were making the wagons, they found it hard to animate, so they basically made a whole set in miniature and the wagons in miniature, and then they shot it and then they animated it. Basically, they traced it onto cells and copied it in an early form of Xerox. So an early form of Xerox appeared in this film.
Ooh. It's a lot of work. That's so much work.
It's a lot of work, and as I said, there are some shortcuts in this film, but it is largely successful in what it tries to achieve.
Yeah, and as I said, broadly, animation probably slightly better. I like that it's clearly a little on the cheaper side, a little on the shortcut side, but I think on the whole, it looks better. So there you go. Suck it, Snow White.
And it has stood the test of time. If you ask people about, say like, okay, Disney films, Disney animated films, just give me a list. Pinocchio always is at the top of people's head. It was re-released 7 times, most recently in 1992, so it is a beloved film in the canon. When You Wish Upon a Star obviously went on to become, it remains their signature tune even to this day.
It's their anthem. It's loosely what our opening theme song is kind of based on.
Okay, I was going to say that, you stole it.
Sorry to Disney, it's not based on it at all, Disney lawyers. It's our own original composition.
It's inspired by, that means you cannot sue us.
Yeah.
So watching this film, actually, even though obviously When You Wish Upon a Star has a very specific context in Pinocchio, when I hear it, it just triggers Disney in my mind.
You see the castle, you see the star going over the castle. I wonder is the town, and the town below the castle, what town is that? Is that the town from Pinocchio? It looks kind of like that. Like even at the end of this film, they pan back up to the sky and the star twinkles because that's the fairy. But you can see like a silhouette of the town, even if it doesn't have a castle. It looks rather similar to like the classic Disney castle logo. Yeah,
but if you go to Disneyland, it's supposed to be Cinderella's castle, so I always thought it was Cinderella's village. Or
maybe that's just retcon though. I wonder when we'll first see that Disney logo. How long will it take? I don't know.
I'm pretty sure this is the case with Snow White as well. I'm not sure. I didn't come across it in my research the last time, but in 1994, Pinocchio was added to the United States National Film Registry for being deemed culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant.
And they only had a handful of films a year, so... I think the latest film in there is from like 2004. So if Snow White's not in there, I'd imagine they'll get to it eventually. I think it's like the Hall of Fame kind of thing where they nominate in a certain number of films every year.
What is it about Pinocchio that you think caused them to want to preserve it?
Well, I think a lot of what Pinocchio when you talk about legacy of these films, I'm like, all right, what from this film has stood the test of time? There's When You Wish Upon a Star, which became again instrumental to the core of Disney's brand identity. There's Lying and Your Nose Grows Big, which is, again, weirdly fundamental to the culture that surrounds this film, even though it's one sequence in the middle of the film that you completely forget about. What else? That's about it, really, from Pinocchio. Like, no one remembers Figaro. No one's like, oh, Figaro. Like, that is a legacy of this film. It is the first cute animal sidekick. But nobody remembers, really, Figaro as the first cute animal sidekick, even though Figaro's adorable, and the world should remember Figaro as the first animal sidekick.
Some readings of this film as well say it's the most kind of down-to-earth and working-class film in Disney's kind of canon, in that as we said earlier, it was analogous for raising children at the time, and it talks about the concerns that parents would have had for their children at the time, and the kind of stuff that they were trying to avoid for them, and the way they were trying to get them to behave, or the people they wanted them to be. So maybe that's also why it has some kind of cultural significance.
It's funny you say that. They take actually a lot of those elements out from the book. Like Geppetto is not this wonderful magical woodshop workland. He's just a poor beggar. He doesn't have a job. He doesn't have money. He can't afford anything. So like he has, as I said in the book, he has to sell his coat just to buy the spelling book for Pinocchio. So like he's completely destitute in the book. Where they do take some of that out of the film. It's a little more, as I said, magical and whimsical, because Disney, I don't think. Well, I was going to say they don't want to portray completely poor people, but they do eventually in their Disney canon films.
Yeah, I mean, it does have that softening and that kind of magical Disney touch, but it doesn't shy away from tough topics. Like, as I said, Monstro was quite scary. The child catching thing, that's also quite scary. There's
also a very important moral that I think reinforces multiple times in the film, which is don't smoke in bed. You'll catch fire. And also, Jiminy Cricket sleeps in a matchbox. Also, like, just not a good place to sleep. It'll catch fire.
Yeah, there's a scene at the start where Geppetto is like, oh, better go to bed. So he lights his pipe in bed.
Yes.
And then starts smoking his pipe. And it's just like, oh, better get one more puff in before bed. And then he hangs up his pipe. It's like, I don't know why that's there.
Yeah, don't drag fire into bed. Not a good idea.
One thing I've noticed, and we'll wrap up on this, over the first two films was Walt Disney the originator of Easter eggs? Because in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, twice in the film, the dwarfs used the term Jiminy Cricket as an exclamation of surprise. And when you look at Pinocchio, at the start, when Jiminy Cricket is setting the scene and he's about to open the storybook to tell the story of Pinocchio, there's two other books on the shelf, which are Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan.
Which they don't make for years, though.
Yeah. Well, the war came in, and we'll talk about this in future episodes, but they were sequestered by the government to make propaganda films, but also the studio was used as a military base. So there's a reason why they shelved a lot of the projects that they had on the table.
Like Peter Pan was 1954. Alice in Wonderland was that later? The 51, so it was earlier. So yeah, they were dropping hints for these films a good decade before they were released.
Yeah, now, well, a good chunk of that decade was taken up by the war, so we have to understand that context as well. But it just shows that Disney had like a big roadmap for what he wanted to do.
He knew what he wanted to co-opt and make millions of dollars on.
Yeah,
Peter Pan.
So I think that's interesting. I think there's a case to be made for that.
Disney. Who wrote Peter Pan?
I know J.M. Barrie.
J.M. Barrie, yeah.
There is a case to say that Walt Disney was the originator of the Easter egg.
I don't know the rest of the history of the world to say that, but there are certainly Easter eggs. I like the way it's like, there's Easter eggs in this film, so you're like, Walt Disney obviously invented that. Well, have you looked up the history of the Easter egg?
I don't know, Gar, but it's in the late... I'm theorising. It's a hot take. It doesn't have to be true.
There you go. Ken Facts.
If you look at it, though, it's the late 30s.
Yeah.
And I don't think... Like, now it seems very obvious, which is why...
And Pixar do a ton of it.
Yeah, which is why it's very dubious as to, it's hard to say where it originated because it's a very obvious thing to do. But then it would have been a genius stroke of marketing.
Well, that's if anybody noticed.
And they're like,
Peter Pan. I'll go read that book and hope for an animated film of it someday. Do you think there were people, like nerd culture these days would pick a film apart like that, and like there'd be 14 articles on the internet of like, did you miss this reference to Peter Pan in Pinocchio? Or I wonder, were people picking films apart like that in the 1940s? I doubt it. I think nerd culture is, some would say, evolved, perhaps devolved into that these days. But
yeah, where it's like, you didn't notice that? Well, maybe you're not a real Disney fan.
You're not a real Disney fan if you didn't spot the Peter Pan reference.
I wonder when people started noticing that stuff or started looking for it. I think,
after obviously Walt Disney invented it personally himself in his office.
Don't make fun of me.
I'll make fun of you all I want. Oh no, Ken is actually mad.
I'm ending the podcast now because I'm so mad.
It's the third time in this episode he's ended the podcast because I've been mean to him.
That's nearly it for our show this week. And Nicole McDonagh is back again this week with another lovely rendition of a classic Disney tune. But first, we got to pay those bills, Gar.
Do we?
We don't have any. Well, there are some bills to the podcast, but...
it's actually quite expensive, really, if you add it up.
It's quite expensive, Gar, but you got to have a hobby.
Which is, like, I'm not spending any money on this podcast, but Ken is. So, like, if you do like it, we do it for free. So, like, the best thing anybody can do for us is either review us on iTunes or whatever your podcast platform is, or just, like, send a tweet being like, look at this podcast. Because, like, podcasts like this are built person by person from the ground up, where you painstakingly deliver the first episode and then hope to God somebody listens to it. And like, I have 2,000 and something Twitter followers, but like, you can get like 2 of them at any given time to do anything you want. Whereas I'll tweet like WWE is bad and like 50 people will like the tweet. It's very upsetting. But yeah, support poor Ken pouring money and his heart and soul into this podcast by just, sharing it a little.
And support Gar pouring half his heart and soul into this podcast.
27% of my heart and soul. There's an actual definable metric of how much of my heart and soul I put into this.
We need to put you on a personal Disney improvement plan, and by the end of the series, we'll get you up to 45% maybe.
Yes. Each week I'll read an extra % of the source material.
You can download new episodes of Magic by Design every Monday, where all magical podcasts are downloaded. Check out the website at magicbydesign.buzzsprout.com. That's buzz like a bee and sprout like those vegetables nobody likes, to see a full list of podcast providers. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Magic by Design Pod, on Twitter at Magic Design Pod, and on Insta at Magic Design Pod. Be sure to keep a close eye on the Instagram, because we are posting some really neat content from Disney animation history and other fascinating content.
What are we posting for Pinocchio?
People will have to wait and see, Gar.
Ooh.
Spoilers. Now, here to play us out with When You Wish Upon a Star from Pinocchio is none other than musical correspondent Nicole McDonagh. We will be back next week at the same time, same place, with a chat about Disney's third animated feature, Fantasia. But until then, stay home, stay safe, and remember to always let your conscience be your guide. Say goodbye, Gar.
I'd say it's a pleasure, but then my nose would grow.
Over to you, Nicole.
Hello, Disney buffs. This is Nicole, your musical correspondent, coming to you live once again from my bedroom. This week it's Pinocchio, and one of my favourite Disney songs, When You Wish Upon a Star. I really think we can all agree that this is the most iconic Disney song. Used to accompany the opening logo sequence into each Disney movie. And not only that, only found out this week that the Disney cruise line ships use the first 7 notes of the melody in their horn signals. Clever marketing. Clever what? So it's sung by the lovely little Jiminy Cricket, voiced by Cliff Edwards. And we hear the song during the opening credits and the final scene. So really good reinforcement there. They knew what they were doing. They're planting that seed. Like last week's Someday My Prince Will Come, When You Wish Upon a Star has been adapted into a jazz standard by a host of jazz performers, including Louis Armstrong, Linda Ronstadt, Glenn Miller, Gregory Porter, Shirley Bassey. The list is endless, you guys. But most recently, Babe. When You Wish Upon a Star was sung by Beyoncé for ABC's Disney Family Sing-Along back in April, bringing us all together during this pandemic. The second volume was released yesterday, so get on that. While on No Bay, I did my best to capture the magic of this historical piece, mixing the old and the new kind of styles, but no Beyoncé riffs, because I'll leave that to Beyoncé. For the most part, I'm sticking to that traditional airy voice feel that's known as the head voice, and I do sway a little bit into the jazz standard, delaying my entry on Like a Bolt. You might notice that when you listen. So traditionally, a choir sings the Fate is Kind verse, which is one of my favourite parts of the whole song. I just think it's so beautiful. I love the harmonies. Brings back so many lovely childhood memories. It's fab. So without further ado, here's my version. Enjoy.